Welcome to Gray Maybe, a limited series podcast and social experiment based on this season's topic, grief. My name is Jillian Schmitz. I'm a professional dancer, actor, teacher, author, artist, and cat lover. Through my own personal journey of recovery, I found that things aren't just black or white, or a simple yes or no. For me, in my recovery, there has been mostly gray area and a lot of maybes. In most of my stories, you can find the gray maybe. I'll be sharing my own process through personal stories and interviews with others in an effort to help investigate the process of and recovery through grief. If you'd like to share your story, please email graymaybestories@gmail.com. graymaybestories@gmail.com. Before we get started, if you haven't already, please subscribe on whichever platform you're using to catch future episodes of Gray Maybe. A note before we start. My stories and the stories of others on this podcast are told through the lens of our own experience. The revelation of our process is ours to tell. If you disagree with the views or stories on this podcast, know that we are not speaking on anything other than our own experiences and viewpoints. Take what you like and leave the rest. Nothing expressed or mentioned in this podcast is an endorsement or is meant to be taken as advice. It is strictly the sharing of our own experiences and recovery. Any feelings this podcast activates in the listener is for the listener to process and recover from. Any criticism you have based on these experiences and choices are yours, and they are not anyone else's burden to carry. Trigger warning: death, grief, cancer. Earlier this year, after season 2 wrapped, I put up a poll on social media to see what listeners might want next as a topic of discussion on Gray Maybe. Although it was close, the poll showed that people wanted to hear a season on the topic of depression and anxiety, which is exactly what I had intended to do. Then, my dad died. And if I'm being perfectly honest, it wasn't just my dad. It was the death of my life pre-pandemic, which included ongoing shifts and losses. The selling of my childhood home, putting down 3 of my beloved senior cats in under a year, my own personal feelings and experiences of aging, and the unexpected passing of a brother-in-law. Grief permeates our lives and experiences, yet socially and culturally, we deal with it the least. It is one of the few things in this life that is guaranteed to each of us. Even if you haven't lost someone close to you, you have felt grief. If you've been in any type of recovery, you know grief. I'd be willing to go even as far to say that grief is a symptom of any recovery. So I decided to change the season's topic. And like anything else that is hard, there is no way around it, only through it. And I hope this season helps you with whatever you might be grieving personally and offer some tools to help others who might be suffering. My 6th grade crush, Mark Silverberg, looked like a dead ringer for Fred Savage, who at the time played a main character, Kevin Arnold, in the popular TV show The Wonder Years. I was completely infatuated with him, but I wasn't sure he felt the same way. I couldn't tell if he liked me. There was someone I thought he did like, and her name was Heather Kelly. Heather Kelly was a pretty girl with shoulder-length black hair and sapphire green eyes. She was a sort of Kennedy of the 6th grade. Her dad was a doctor. She was confident, smart, and well-dressed. She was naturally pretty, and unlike my very trendy teased and permed hair, her hair was beautifully untampered with. She had strong opinions and could be quite harsh. To put it bluntly, Heather Kelly could be kind of a bitch. However, she was still very proper and someone you wanted on your side, and to be best friends with if she would have you. After coming home from school one day, My mom announced with a sullen face, "We're going to Heather's house, so get ready." I was confused. Heather wasn't one of my close friends. How did my mom know who Heather was? Or where Heather lived? Before I could respond, she added, "Heather's mom died. We're bringing Heather and her family dinner. Go get your boots on." This is a very common protocol in places like the Midwest. When someone is sick or passes, the community, racked with sympathy, organizes a schedule of homemade food deliveries, frequently called meal trains. They visit you, bring you dinner, and sometimes just sit with you. I've always appreciated the thought behind this gesture, but in actual practice, I thought that if I was on the receiving end, the second to last thing I would want to do is entertain others, especially strangers. My mom marched my brother and I up the concrete front porch stairs of Heather's house and produced the homemade lasagna pan, topped with tinfoil, to Heather's father. I watched my mom intensely. She had whipped herself up into a frenzy of excitement and positivity that until this exact moment did not exist. I could feel the tension underneath her facade. That. What exactly is that? My mom continued with pleasantries, almost giddy. Heather's dad was tall, handsome, and friendly. Their house was nice. I tried to imagine what Heather's mom looked like and how she fit into this house. My mom continued her charade of nervous small talk with Heather's dad in the kitchen. I overheard her chattering off the lasagna ingredients, followed by, "You just pop it in the oven for 20 minutes at 350 degrees. Meanwhile, I was following Heather around as she gave me a tour of her house. I was battling what felt like embarrassment for the situation. How do I act towards Heather? Should I be super nice to her? That would be easiest. After all, I felt horrible for her to lose her mother at such a young age. I couldn't imagine how that would be for me and my brother. But that extra niceness, it would only be because her mom died. It seemed situational, inauthentic, or put on. Should I just treat her like normal? Or is that cold and callous? Do I join in on my mom's cheerleading or play it cool? At 11 years old, I had already spent enough time watching adults curate their conversations, walk on eggshells, and tiptoe around the truth. I was always confused and annoyed. Why didn't they just say the thing, whatever it was? When they didn't, it felt wrong. The polite cover-up seemed to take such an immense amount of additional energy and ultimately changed nothing. Maybe that was the point. Heather ended the tour in her room. She seemed normal, but a little glum. She had told me her mom had been sick with cancer for a long time, and then she flopped on her bed and said, "Everyone's being so nice to me now. All the kids at school and even the teachers. All because my mom died." She noticed it too. Even in tragedy, Heather seemed composed. Already naturally pretty, she now seemed beautiful, regal, actually. I thought to myself selfishly, how could Mark Silverberg not like her over me? In the next room, I heard my mom running out of small talk. I could feel her discomfort and anxiety start to peak. I knew we'd be leaving soon. She started to repeat herself, which meant we were going to be leaving in less than 5 minutes. I made myself and my brother available on cue. We exchanged pleasantries and exited, marching back down the same cement stairs and into my mom's car. I watched my mom shake off what had just happened. The anxiety dropped and it was replaced with what I can only explain as a type of relief. Relief to not be feeling that thing firsthand. Not long after Heather's mom died, we found out my grandmother had been diagnosed with cancer. I recall seeing her once in the hospital looking quite different than all the other times I'd seen her. Her usual excitement tampered by exhaustion, her skin yellow from jaundice. The hospital smells of medicine and sterility, the pressure to act upbeat, be the ray of light for her, for everyone, when I knew very well this was not at all an upbeat moment for anyone. My gut was filled with paralyzing fear and overall discomfort. Not long after the visit, I got the news that my grandma had passed from my dad. He had been talking to my mom, who had been with her when she had passed. Immediately, I felt so alone. Other members of my family may have been home, but we were all separate. Maybe my brother was at a baseball game or in his room, and my dad at the baseball game or in the garage, I don't recall. I do remember going outside to try to escape the staleness, the silence, and the loneliness. I needed to flee this feeling, whatever it was. It was especially windy outside, the air blowing my hair around as violently as the leaves on the trees around me. Incidental raindrops whizzed around, hitting me in the face. I knew I was supposed to feel sad, and I did, but I didn't know what to do with it, how to express it, if it would leave, when it would leave, or where it would go. I didn't know how to accept that this was natural. Nothing about it felt natural. I walked to my best friend's house next door, only to find them loading their beloved family dog in the car to be taken to the vet to be put down. I couldn't escape it. I was surrounded by terrible, unmitigated sadness. My friend's family were united in their anguish. Even my friend's dad, Bill, had tears running down his face, and his voice was breaking as he explained the dire situation. They were so entrenched in their sorrow. It didn't feel right to tell them about my grandma. I remember the funeral. I remember the open casket and how my grandma looked, just like she was sleeping. Her skin a little less yellow, but still an unnatural hue. It looked like if I stared long enough, I could see her breathing, and that at any moment, maybe she would wake up. I remember the black apparel everyone drenched themselves in, and the somber church organ music. The adults seemed to show sympathy towards my brother and I, but it was only with whatever extra energy they had left over from their own overwhelm. All of the adults around me were completely present in it. That, whatever that is, was so strong. There was so little discussion about any of it, only around it. This thing that was happening had the power to render chatterboxes completely mute. Taking it all in, I summed up that this sadness as being so terrible that it was best to not be discussed. After the funeral, I watched as adults around me somberly carried on, tearfully and silently. A year or so later, I experienced my first depressive episode. There was that thing again, only this time, I couldn't pinpoint its origin. It permeated every corner of my emotional body, but it had no source. Why was it here? It came in waves, but was always omnipresent. Why was I so sad? Why did everything hurt so much? My depression would come and go from this moment forward, and although it wasn't constantly at the forefront of my everyday life, it also was never very far away. As I moved through life, like anyone else, I continued to experience many micro-life heartaches, loss of relationships, loss of friendships, loss of job opportunities or prospects, hurt feelings, and damaged expectations. Some bigger, like friends getting sick and some of them dying, loss of pets, and the secondary sadness experienced when watching those you love suffer. Loss of identity, loss of career, loss of dreams, and all of the feelings that come with recovery. It was in the recovery rooms when I first heard someone refer to recovery as the unthawing of grief. In the fall of 2019, my dad was diagnosed with progressive supranuclear palsy, PSP, a rare neurological disorder that affects body movements, walking and balance, and eye movements. PSP is caused by damage to nerve cells in areas of the brain that control thinking and body movements. To date, there is very little known about how to treat PSP, and there are no cures. It's a degenerative disease that has a prognosis of 7 to 10 years after diagnosis. My dad's condition accelerated over the last 4 years, and by the spring of 2023, he could not walk unassisted, nor do any physical tasks or speak. He needed 24/7 supervision and care from my mother. This past April, my dad was admitted to the hospital for a bladder infection that had turned septic, and he had aspirated. Typical of what eventually happens with someone with PSP, their ability to swallow becomes hindered and eventually stops. The prognosis was palliative care. I was able to see him before he was sedated for comfort, and we moved him to hospice where he passed peacefully, surrounded by my mother, my brother, and I. I was not surprised by my grief for my father. I had grieved his passing ever since I was a kid. He smoked cigarettes and drank his whole life. He had high blood pressure, a temper, and type 2 diabetes. Besides his activity level, he was not the picture of health. Growing up, my mom, brother, and I all took turns trying to get him to stop smoking. The fear of him dying while I was young was always present for me. When I was 22, he had a stroke. He was lucky to make a full recovery. My grief lurked, despite my dad not having another major health scare after that. When my dad was diagnosed, it validated my fears and gave me a timeline to digest the moment I thought I'd unfortunately prepared for. My relationship with my dad is and was complicated. We didn't agree a lot and spent a lot of my adult relationship with him arguing, and often my feelings were deeply hurt. Growing up, he was part charmer, part tyrant, and you didn't always know which one you were going to get. Even as my dad aged, became frail and nonverbal, my memory of his temper remained, as did the fear of his hostility. At the end, though, he had lost his ability to speak, so he couldn't say anything hurtful. A once vehemently opinionated man, if you wonder where I get it. In his final years, he lacked any preference or care. A common symptom of PSP is apathy. His eyes did light up when he saw me, and he would reach out his arms for an embrace. Helping to plan his funeral and giving the eulogy was an experience I can only mark as interesting. Going through the motions, seeing family members I haven't for decades, watching people confront their own mortality and nostalgia for the past, as I confronted my own mortality and nostalgia for a past that I also wished could have been a little different. I tried to make a special effort to really see the children that attended and talk to them. Specifically, my niece and nephew, who were around the ages of my brother and I when my grandma passed away. While I was in the thick of my dad's passing, I started to take note of how people personally dealt with grief, my own experience, and also how others interacted with me. I noticed tangible helplessness of those close to me while they witnessed my grief. I picked up on the relief of some people when they asked how I was. I could tell how badly they wanted me to be okay. So I'd say fine or okay, instead of how I really felt or thought, and noticed I still had some old people-pleasing left in me. I noticed how some people don't want to address it at all, perhaps a fear of reigniting the sadness. I also noticed a phenomenon where people avoid you and stay far away, treating that emotion of grief almost like an airborne pathogen that they don't want to be infected with. I don't blame them. When I decided to pivot this season's topic, certain people came immediately to mind. People who I knew had either been public about their journey of grief or that had walked this painful path before me. These people I knew had gone straight through the fire and unabashedly lived to tell about it. They knew all too well how it goes. They're familiar with the exhaustion, and they can concur brain fog is very real. They are all experts on this topic in their own right. They may or may not have made peace with this thing we've all come to call grief, but they've somehow been able to call a truce. These warriors of grief are who you'll be hearing from in this season of Gray Maybe. If you're listening to this episode and you're experiencing grief, welcome, and I hope this helps your journey. You're not alone. Just a reminder for anyone who needs to hear it, you don't need to have experienced a giant catastrophic event or a death to experience grief. Know that whatever you're feeling, there are those among us who have probably felt it too. You're not alone. If you're listening and you have someone you love in your life that is grieving, welcome. You are also not alone. We as a society have a long way to go in being able to tolerate and help those closest to us manage grief. I've included a link in the show notes for the do's and don'ts, which I'm going to read here. Don't assign positive meaning to their loss. In our effort to encourage and support the griever, we may try to project the current situation into a better future way too soon. Saying, "Time will heal all things," is not helpful. Prophesizing a future positive meaning on top of the grieving person's crushing and devastating loss tends to minimize the griever's current agony, essentially suggesting that they sweep their pain under the rug while focusing on some potential positive long-term outcome. Stay in the moment with the griever. Follow the grieving person's lead. Be an attentive, active listener. Allow the griever to take the conversation where it needs to go. Make room for plenty of silence. Don't jump in to fill space with unnecessary commentary. Sometimes before a two-way conversation can even begin, the griever just wants someone to sit with, literally or virtually. No questions or words of comfort are needed to fill silence. Presence is often what the griever really needs. On their own, sometimes the grieving person will identify a silver lining or hopeful thought that adds meaning to their loss. This is a normal and often constructive way to cope with grief. Remember, the griever is the only person who can know what this loss means to them. Only the griever can make meaning of their experience. Once they do so, it's appropriate to support them in their newfound hope. Use the name of the lost loved one. While you are comforting the griever, all of their emotions are tied up in the loss of their beloved. Saying their loved one's name out loud is a way of validating the life of that person. Say Anne, not your sister. Say Alan, not your son. Say Stu, not your husband. Don't ever be afraid to mention the person lost. Grievers want to talk. Memories are all that remain after a loss, and talking about the person who died helps to keep them alive in broken hearts. Refrain from platitudes. Refrain from platitudes, religious or otherwise, like, "They are in a better place," or "Time heals all things," or "Everything happens for a reason." Don't pretend that you know the answer. You don't. No one does. As a person who desires to support a griever, pay attention to what you say. Never say anything that starts with the phrase, "at least." Comparing and contrasting your own grief experiences or dreamed up hypothetical ones with the reality of the loss that just happened is missing the mark in several ways. Making your loss the topic of conversation is asking the grieving person to switch their focus and empathize with your grief at a time when the total focus should be on them. Don't say, "I know how you feel." You don't. Seems to me describing how something worse could have happened represents a thwarted attempt to say something, no matter how unhelpful. Stay out of your empty word, ill-informed autopilot script. Choose not to go there. Be open to the expression of any emotion. As an active listener, be open to any emotions the griever may express through verbal or nonverbal means. Anger, yelling, silence, rage, disbelief, denial, crying, pacing around the room, shouting, rocking back and forth, wringing hands, clenched fists, avoiding eye contact, needing to be held, avoiding touch, etc. Be observant about what the griever is expressing, overt or subtle, and allow a safe space to be in that moment. Do not in any way tell them not to feel what they are feeling. Remember anniversaries. Try to remember anniversaries such as the birthday of the person who died and the anniversary of the date of their death. Sending a card or a text will let the griever know that you are remembering too, reminding them that they are not alone. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you were able to find something relatable in today's episode. If you'd like to show your support for this podcast, consider making a donation on Spotify. It would also be very helpful if you could rate, share, comment, and subscribe. If you'd like to contact the podcast, please email graymaybestories@gmail.com, graymaybestories@gmail.com. Thank you to everyone who helped make this Gray Maybe podcast happen. producer and editor Roderick Barge, cover photo by Jose Perez, music licensed by Pixabay, special counsel Jada Ellingham and Roderick Barge. Special shout out to supporter Patty Olgan. Until next time, bye for now.